Ever wondered how ancient Rome, without electricity or modern machinery, managed to create palaces so luxurious they'd shame a five-star resort today? It wasn't just gold and marble, it was a hidden world of advanced engineering. We're about to expose the secret technology that made Roman imperial grandeur possible. On the Palatine Hill, where Rome's oldest legends clung to the soil, the emperors raised more than residences. They built a machine for power, an architecture of command, comfort, and spectacle. From a distance, an imperial palace looked like the triumph of stone and scale. Terraces stacked above the forum, colonnades catching the sun, roofs glittering with tiles. Yet the true marvel did not sit in plain sight. The palace was alive beneath its surfaces, threaded with water lines, warmed by invisible fire, and held aloft by concrete bones that could defy time. The Flavian dynasty, eager to anchor its authority after civil war, understood what architecture could accomplish. Under Emperor Domitian, the Palatine was reshaped into an imperial world unto itself. The vast Flavian palace, a complex that modern scholars often describe in two great halves, the Domus Flavia for public ceremony and state, and the Domus Augustana for the emperor's more private life. Even those labels, inherited through later interpretation, do not fully convey the experience. This was a place designed to overwhelm, immense halls that swallowed sound, courtyards that staged controlled, vistas of sky and water, and dining spaces where the empire seemed to gather at one table. But the marble facade was only the final mask. Behind it lay systems that had to work every hour of every day, not for a city, but for a single household that was also a government. Fountains could not stutter. Baths could not run cold. Latrines, kitchens, laundries, gardens, and ceremonial pools demanded constant supply and constant removal. Water in, waste out, heat distributed, smoke controlled, floors kept dry, walls kept warm. In an age without motors and switches, the palace required a different kind of energy: gravity, fire, and human labor organized with ruthless precision. The question then is not simply how Rome built palaces of such beauty. The question is how Rome kept them functioning, how luxury became reliable, repeatable, and political. The answer begins not in the throne room, but in the quiet discipline of moving water. Rome's aqueducts are often remembered as monuments marching across valleys on endless arches, but their most important work happened where nobody looked: underground, in tunnels, settling tanks, and distribution chambers. Water was not merely for thirst. In an imperial palace, water was display and dominance. The sound of it in courtyards, the shimmer of it in basins, the steam of it in baths, the unspoken message that abundance could be summoned at will. By Domitian's reign, Rome drew on multiple aqueduct systems, some begun in the Republic and expanded under emperors hungry for supply. The sources lay miles away in the hills, springs captured, channels laid with careful gradients so slight they could be measured in fingers over hundreds of paces. The genius was not speed but steadiness. A stream that fell too quickly tore at its own channel. Too slowly it stagnated. Roman engineers learned to negotiate the land, carving through ridges in darkness, bridging depressions, with arcades and guiding water toward the city as if coaxing it along a leash. As the water approached Rome, it fed distribution points, castella, where flow could be divided. From there, lead pipes, terracotta conduits, and masonry channels carried it onward. The palace on the Palatine was not a simple endpoint, it was a high place, and height is tyranny to water. Yet Romans did not depend on pumps. They relied on planning. They raised aqueduct channels to commanding elevations so gravity could do the work. And where terrain demanded tricks, they used pressure itself as a tool. Inverted siphons, most famously used in certain provincial aqueducts, demonstrated the principle. Water forced down into a valley in a closed pipe could rise again on the far side, driven by its own head of pressure. In Rome, the primary aqueducts generally favored arcs and tunnels, but the understanding behind siphons, pressure managed by elevation and containment, still shaped how water could be delivered across difficult ground and into complex buildings. Within the city, pressure could be moderated through cisterns and intermediary tanks, calming surges and allowing impurities to settle. The palace needed that control. Too much pressure could rupture pipes, too little could leave a fountain silent and a bath tepid. So beneath Domitian's grand rooms, Out of sight of senators and petitioners, there were practical spaces, service corridors, maintenance access, storage, and the necessary ugliness of hydraulics. Water had to reach private latrines as well as public showpieces, and Roman elites expected latrines not as crude pits but as engineered seats flushed by steady flow. Waste, in turn, had to be carried away, channeled down slopes toward the city's drains and sewers. The Palatine's position helped here. Gravity could remove what gravity had delivered as long as the gradients were right and the channels remained clear. Imagine a courtyard in the Flavian palace with a central basin. The water arrives not as a miracle, but as a calculated end to a long journey. Captured at a spring, guided by a precisely graded channel, filtered in settling. Tanks divided at a castellum, fed into pipes whose diameters govern volume, and released into a fountain designed to sing at a chosen pitch. The luxury is not the water itself, it is the certainty of it. And certainty demanded vigilance. Sediment accumulated, lime built up, pipes corroded, valves and junctions had to be inspected. The palace's comfort rested on a workforce that rarely appears in the marble portrait of empire, laborers, technicians, and enslaved people who learned the hidden geography of conduits as intimately as a courtier knew corridors. When fountains played and pools stayed clear, power looked effortless. When they faltered, the illusion cracked. Yet water alone could not make a palace feel like the center of the world. Marble floors are cold in winter, and Rome's grandeur was meant to be lived in, not merely admired, to transform stone into comfort. The palace relied on another invisible system, one that turned fire into warmth without letting fire be seen. The hypocaust was Rome's quiet revolution in luxury. The word suggests something buried and secret, and that is exactly what it was, a heating system built into the architecture itself, an artificial climate created beneath the feet of emperors. In a palace like Domitian's, warmth was not just a pleasure, it was a language of supremacy. To step from a chilly exterior into a hall where the air felt tempered, controlled, and steady was to cross an invisible border into imperial order. The mechanism began in the service areas, in furnace rooms where fires were kept alive. These were not decorative hearths. They were engines fed constantly with wood, tended with discipline. The heat and smoke from the furnace praefurnium were guided under raised floors. The floors were not laid directly on ground. They were suspended on a forest of small pillars, usually of brick or tile, called pilae. Above those pilae sat thick slabs and layers of mortar, forming the walking surface. The space beneath became a horizontal flue, a hot, dry underworld where air could circulate, but underfloor heat alone would not warm tall rooms evenly. Roman builders extended the system upward through hollow wall tiles, tubuli, creating vertical channels that drew hot air along the walls and encouraged a rising draft. The room, in effect, became part of the furnace's lungs. Warmth climbed, spread, and escaped through vents pulling fresh hot air behind it. The beauty of the design was its subtlety. No open flames disturbed the serenity of a chamber. No soot-stained rafters betrayed the machinery of comfort. The heat arrived as if it belonged to the building. In the bath suites associated with elite living, whether in palace, complexes, or attached facilities, this control of heat became even more sophisticated. Different rooms demanded different temperatures, warm spaces for transition, hot rooms where steam and sweat were part of ritual, and cooler areas for recovery. Roman bathing culture was not a simple wash, it was choreography. To sustain it, the hypocaust had to be paired with water management. Hot water heated in boilers, cold water stored, flows controlled, so that basins could be filled and drained without chaos. The palace demanded the same coordination except intensified by scale and by the expectation that the emperor's household could entertain, relax, and perform statecraft in comfort regardless of season. This comfort was expensive. Hypocausts needed constant fuel. They needed constant cleaning because ash and soot were relentless. They also required careful construction. Too much heat could crack floors. Too little would render the system a hollow boast. The distribution of pilae had to support the weight above while leaving pathways for air. The placement of flues mattered. Even the choice of materials mattered. Brick and tile held heat and resisted flame better than many stones. The palace, therefore, was designed with its climate in mind from the beginning, not retrofitted as an afterthought. Modern heating and ventilation aim for the same goals: steady temperature, managed airflow, comfort without visible effort. But Rome accomplished this with no electricity, no compressors, no thermostats. The price was labor. Where modern systems hide their cost in distant power plants, Rome hid its cost in human bodies: the men who carried fuel, the hands that stoked fires through the night, the workers who crawled into maintenance spaces choked with soot. The emperor's warm floors were, in a very literal sense, built on invisible toil, and heat demanded another kind of mastery, because a palace warmed by fire is only safe if its structure can endure temperature, weight, and time. Beneath the decoration, Rome's imperial buildings depended on a construction technology so powerful it still shapes skylines today: concrete. The popular imagination often credits Rome's grandeur to stone blocks, stacked with perfect joints, but the empire's true structural magic was opus caementicium, Roman concrete. It was not the modern mix of Portland cement, but a blend of lime mortar, water, and aggregate, often strengthened by volcanic ash known as pozzolana. This ash, especially abundant around the Bay of Naples, allowed concrete to set strongly even in damp conditions and in certain circumstances to endure environments that would destroy lesser mortars. It was a material that freed architects from the tyranny of straight lines and short spans. In the Flavian palace, that freedom became space. Vaults could soar over enormous rooms. Corridors could curve and carry weight above. Terraces could be piled upon terraces, each supporting gardens, colonnades, and pools. The palace was not one building, but a landscape of architecture, and Roman concrete made that landscape possible. The arch was the essential gesture. With arches, weight could be redirected into piers and walls rather than pressing down on a brittle lintel. From the arch came the barrel vault, and from vaults came domes and complex spatial sequences, rooms that opened into one another with theatrical timing. The palace could stage movement, a narrowing corridor that heightened anticipation, then a sudden release into a vast hall where coffered ceilings and polished stone amplified the sense of arrival. Yet concrete and arches alone did not create imperial space. Rome mastered facing techniques: brick-faced concrete, stone veneer, marble revetment, so the structural core could be strong and practical, while the visible surfaces could be exquisite. The eye saw marble. The building's body was often brick and concrete, stitched together with measured precision. Brick stamps found by archaeologists, bearing marks of workshops and sometimes estates, hint at the organization behind the scenes: supply chains, standardized production, and imperial control of materials. Logistics were as vital as design. The Palatine did not produce marble. It did not produce pozzolana. It did not produce the endless tiles needed for hypocaust pile and wall flues. Materials had to be quarried, shaped, shipped, and hauled. The Tiber was Rome's great artery for heavy transport, carrying stone and timber into the city. From river ports, loads were dragged through streets and up slopes, a slow procession of carts, animals, ropes, and human muscle. Cranes, some powered by tread wheels, lifted blocks and timbers into position, guided by practiced teams who understood leverage as well as any modern engineer. This was not improvisation, it was administration. An imperial palace project demanded coordination between architects, engineers, foremen, craftsmen, and a vast labor force. It demanded schedules, storage, and security. Domitian's building campaign, like others before and after it, was as much a demonstration of control over resources as it was a statement of taste. To raise a palace was to prove that the emperor could command stone, water, fire, and people, shaping them into a single coherent vision. And when the walls rose and the vaults locked into place, the palace still was not complete. It had to be finished with surfaces worthy of its purpose: marble cut and fitted like skin, columns aligned in long ranks, gilded details catching lamplight, pigments laid onto plaster with a craftsman's patience. The visible luxury was dazzling, but it was only credible because the hidden systems never ceased to function. Water had to arrive, heat had to circulate, roofs had to shed rain, drains had to carry away waste. The palace was a promise, and a promise can collapse if its machinery fails. That is why Roman luxury at its highest level, cannot be understood as decoration alone. It was a total environment engineered to persuade. The marble was the argument, the technology was the evidence, and once that evidence existed, once comfort and spectacle could be produced reliably, its consequences reached far beyond the Palatine. In the imperial world, architecture was politics rendered in stone. A palace like Domitian's did not simply house an emperor. It staged the empire's hierarchy. The public wing offered spaces for ceremony, judgment, and reception. Rooms calibrated to remind visitors through sheer scale and controlled movement that they had entered a realm where ordinary rules no longer applied. A hall could dwarf a senator's confidence. A glittering courtyard could suggest the favor of the gods. A fountain could imply that the empire's resources flowed naturally toward the throne. The hidden technologies made that staging possible day after day. Water features were not occasional luxuries. They were sustained performances. Heated rooms were not seasonal indulgences. They were part of the palace's daily rhythm. The palace could host gatherings even in cooler months without surrendering comfort. It could offer baths that signaled refinement and command. It could keep gardens green and courtyards fresh, turning the hilltop into an artificial oasis above the crowded city. These comforts also carried social weight. In a Rome where many lived in cramped apartments and faced the constant risk of fire and collapse, the palace's stability and abundance were a form of propaganda. The emperor's world appeared ordered, clean and secure, water on demand, warmth underfoot, vast spaces held up by vaults that seemed to float. Even when critics condemned imperial excess, they did so in language that acknowledged its potency. Luxury was controversial precisely because it worked. It could awe, seduce, and silence. And yet, the palace was never purely personal indulgence. It was an administrative node. Decisions that shaped provinces and armies could be made in rooms warmed by hypocausts, beside basins fed by distant springs. Petitioners might wait in courtyards cooled by fountains, their impatience softened by shade and water's sound. Rituals of power from formal audiences to banquets depended on the smooth operation of the palace's infrastructure. Engineering was not separate from governance, it was one of its instruments. The Roman mastery of systems also carried lessons that outlived individual emperors. The Palatine complex did not remain frozen in Domitian's lifetime. Later rulers expanded, repaired, and altered it. Fires and neglect could damage even the strongest structures, but the underlying principles endured. Concrete cores, vaulted supports, managed water supply, controlled heat. Rome's building culture became a language that could be spoken again and again with variations across centuries. Modern architects and engineers, looking back, often admire the endurance of Roman concrete and the elegance of gravity-fed aqueducts. But the deeper lesson lies in integration. The palace was not a shell to be decorated after construction. It was an organism whose bones, veins, and lungs were designed together. Beauty depended on maintenance. Comfort depended on logistics. Splendor depended on the unglamorous discipline of drains, flues, reservoirs, and repairs. There is also a sharper lesson, less comfortable but impossible to ignore. Roman luxury, for all its ingenuity, was built on unequal foundations. The warmth beneath imperial feet required relentless fueling. The water that sparkled in marble basins required constant oversight. The people who made it work rarely shared its comforts. Engineering served power, and power ensured engineering continued. On the Palatine Hill, the empire's grandeur was not merely displayed, it was manufactured, sustained, and defended by technology hidden behind polished surfaces. The fountains, the baths, the heated floors, the soaring vaults, all of it formed a single message, that Rome could bend nature into obedience and that the emperor stood at the center of that control. And when the sun fell behind the city's rooftops, when torches and oil lamps began to glow along colonnades, the palace did what it had been designed to do. Water continued to murmur in the dark. Warm air still moved unseen through hollow walls. Vaults held the night's weight without complaint. Above the sleeping city, the Palatine remained awake. An engineered summit of comfort and command, proving in silence that Roman luxury was never simply about what could be seen, but about what could be made to work.